right. So I'm Bridget Indelicato from Mindful Gardening and the Innisfil Seed Library, and welcome to Planning Your Garden. This webinar is part of a series called Get Out and Grow, which is in partnership with the Rizzardo Health and Wellness Centre. And you'll find registration info on my website. So you'll find it at mindfulgardening.ca, as well as the Innisfil Seed Library website, which is innisfilseedlibrary.ca. And you can register. They go right through every month until September. And we also have some Q&As. So if you have some questions on those months, we'd love to have you join us for that. So today, I hope this session will help you decide what to grow in your space this season and how to succeed. I'll be focusing on getting the most out of small spaces when you're growing food. And again, if you have questions, please type them in the box and we'll take those up at the end. And I should mention, I have Sarah Corcoran, who is a health associate with the Rizzardo Centre, and she's on the call today. If you have any tech issues, shoot her a message and she'll help you out. So what to grow? This is the fun part where you're imagining what you're going to grow. However, it is important to consider when you're growing in small spaces or containers that there are some challenges. This could include overcrowding your plants, which in turn might reduce airflow and cause disease with your plants. And also your plants will compete for nutrition. So that's a few things to consider, as well as your location. Perhaps the location that you've put your containers or selected your garden isn't meeting the needs of your plants. So those are some things to sort of think about as you're dreaming up what plants you'll be growing. So you'll be considering a few main things. So transplants are generally for your long maturing plants that grow throughout the season. And that would include tomatoes and peppers, eggplant. So they're plants that take the entire season essentially to produce your harvest. And you can also jumpstart some plants that you might direct sow. So for example, lettuce, you could start those ahead of time indoors, and then you'll have sort of a jumpstart on your harvest of lettuce. Direct sow seeds are, there's so many easy seeds that can be directly planted into your soil. Peas, beans, carrot, radish, those sorts of things. Very simple to grow directly in your soil. And then you're not worrying about taking up space in your home under grow lights. Soil is really important thing to consider. You'll want nutrient-rich soil for your plants, whether they're in ground or in pots. And I'll be going into some detail about what that looks like in terms of nutrition. And look at the space you have available for your garden. How large are your pots? How much garden space do you have? And how do you essentially maximize production without overcrowding and leading to problems with your plants being overcrowded? And in terms of location, most plants thrive in direct sunlight for most of the day. So 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight is where your plants will probably do their best. So think about that when you're selecting where you'll be growing. So what to grow? In terms of transplant, these again are your long maturing plants, your tomatoes, your peppers, your eggplant. Cabbage takes a while, and it's something that you should start indoors to get that nice large cabbage head. And a lot of herbs can be started as transplants. Got basil, parsley, rosemary, sage, thyme. Direct sow, again, kind of the world's your oyster. A lot of the leafy greens, so your lettuce, Swiss chard, spinach, kale, mustard greens, they grow really quickly and are quite delicious. And then you've got your root vegetables, so your carrot, beet, radish, turnip, rutabaga, onion, and of course your peas and your beans, so from your legume family. And you can also direct sow lots of herbs, including dill and coriander. They grow quite well that way. And a lot of these direct sow plants that you would typically grow in the spring, so radish, spinach, you can plant them again later in the season, so later in the summer, for a fall harvest when the weather starts to cool again, because they do thrive in that cooler weather. So your direct sown seeds can really have a life throughout the season. So looking at soil, essentially your plants need these three main nutrients. So you've got nitrogen, which helps to develop leaves and produce chlorophyll. So photosynthesis in those leaves, you need that nitrogen for that to happen and to give you that nice green color of your leaves. So if you notice some of your plants are starting to yellow, for example, it's likely a nitrogen deficiency. Phosphorus is the other big one, and this is really important for plants to develop their root system and to produce flowers and fruit. So your tomato plants, your pepper plants, they need phosphorus to fruit. And finally, potassium helps, again, to develop a good, strong root system and strong stems. So having a good balance of all three of these in your soil will give you a really good starting place for your plants. So how do you get these nutrients? Again, healthy organic soil makes healthy plants. I avoid chemical fertilizers. I like to use organic, natural supplements. So to get, again, we've got our NPK, which is our nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus combination. Cow and or sheep manure, sometimes you can purchase it as a combo, is a really good source of those, all three of those. And they make an excellent amendment. And you can fork that into your soil in the fall or the spring, just to really get that into your soil. Plant compost is another excellent source of all three of those nutrients. So you can add both the manure and the plant compost. Now I've included something that I've just started doing last year, which is comfrey tea. You may know the comfrey plant. It grows large green leaves fairly quickly. Mine are about, I'd say, 6 inches above the ground right now. They are herbaceous, so they die back completely and then come up in the spring. And they flower a sort of pretty purplish flower that the bumblebees love. So again, you're attracting pollinators with this plant. And its leaves are quite generous and can be used to create a comfrey tea. So this is a really concentrated tea that you basically steep those leaves for about 4 weeks in a 5-gallon bucket with the lid on. It smells horrible, but it's that decomposition that is releasing all these incredible nutrients. So that top 3 plus a lot of trace nutrients that plant pulls from the ground. It has a very long taproot and it pulls out all the awesome stuff out of the earth and then basically into your plants. Now it's a very concentrated concoction. So you're actually adding water to it. So it's 1 part of the tea to 3 parts water. I typically use a 4-cup measuring cup to 12 cups of water. And then you're supplementing fertilizer through the season on your maturing plants. So once your tomatoes, for example, start to produce flowers and fruit, you'd give it a hit of that underneath. You don't want to put it on young transplants or young plants because it is still fairly concentrated, even when it's diluted, and it can burn your plants. But it is amazing. It made such a difference in production of my beans and my tomatoes last year. So I'd highly recommend you get a comfrey plant and have a little storage of tea. For nitrogen, there's so many natural ways you can get that. So shredded leaves in the fall, you can dress your beds with shredded leaves, leave them over winter, and then in the spring, the worms and microbes will start to do their work. You'll get the worm castings because they'll eat the leaves and further fertilize your soil. And it just adds a lot of organic matter to your soil and in some ways to aeration. So you've got, that nice bulky soil with leaves in there. And as they're breaking down, you've got a nice airflow in that soil, which is a really good thing for it. Some other supplements for nitrogen, you can buy fish emulsion, follow the directions on how to use that. It's another stinky one, so you'll have a bit of a fishy smell in your garden if you don't mind that. Blood meal is another amendment that you can add nitrogen to your soil. And it's also been known to be a deterrent for rodents and such. They don't like the smell of other animals' blood, I suppose. It's something I don't really use in my garden, but it is a high nitrogen source if you're looking for that. One thing I do use, though, is bone meal. So bone meal is high in phosphorus, and I will use that for my fruiting plants. So it goes into the hole that you're planting your tomatoes, for example, and it's a granular substance, and it'll break down slowly over time so that it will feed that plant through its whole life cycle. And I did see a big difference in production and the health of my plant with bone meal. Again, if you're vegan, it's not something you'll want to have, but it is something considered organic and natural. And for potassium, seed compost, so that's essentially ground shrimp shells and seaweed, is another excellent amendment to add to your soil. I did add that to my tomato bed last year, in addition to cow and sheep manure, and I had really great results. So that's another thing that you can add, or you can add it with plant compost. So essentially, you're looking at a way to really get your soil as a good base for your plants before you're planting them. So when to grow? So our region, Innisfil area, we're considered planting zone 5A. So our last spring frost date is coming up. It's usually around May 20th. So the long weekend is usually a signal that the tide is turning and we're coming towards warmer weather. Of course, it's an estimate. We've been known to have frosts in June. It happens. But that's something to keep in mind as you're moving forward with which seeds to plant prior to that first frost date, and transplants and seeds to plant after that frost date. So you can sort of look at this as cool vegetables or herbs versus warm season vegetables and herbs. So our cool seasons, so things that can be pretty much planted as soon as the soil is workable. And we've had a fairly cool spring, so we're not too late on some of these. So pea, spinach, lettuce, Swiss chard, kale, mustard greens, carrot, beet, radish, green onion, turnip, parsley, and coriander. These are generally quick to grow. They have a short season. And you can also grow these again in late summer for fall harvest when we start to cool off again. So again, you can continue growing these. And in some cases, you can grow them in succession, like Swiss chard. You can grow through the summer. They don't mind the heat of the sun. So you can grow some of these throughout the summer, like every couple of weeks, if you want to have that, harvest throughout the summer. Our warm season, there are slow to mature, long season. They'll probably be in your garden from transplant right through to just before frost. So that would include your tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, cabbage, rutabaga. Now, bean is something that you can either start indoors or direct sow, but they like warm soil. So they'll do better planted after that last frost date. So if those leaves emerge and they're hit by frost, it may kill the plant. And of course, your basil, dill, rosemary, sage, these are all warm season plants that appreciate warm weather to really thrive. So how to grow? Now I've selected some plants that I recommend for limited space or for new gardeners to give it a try. I know a lot of folks have started gardening since the pandemic has started. So you may have started a garden last year and you're gung-ho this year to grow again or to grow more. So these are plants that I would recommend you grow this season to have success and really good harvest. And they're generally easy to maintain and will give you the most reward. Of course, tomatoes. I think most of us like tomatoes quite a bit. Again, you're looking at planting these after our last frost date. So they should be planted a week or two after May 20th. Now, if we do get a cold snap, there are tricks to protect your plants. I grow my tomatoes with tomato cages, so I'll drape old bed sheets over them if we're expecting a chilly night. And that tends to protect the plant as long as you uncover it when the morning comes. Some people will cover them with plastic sheeting. You may recall we had snow last May. It wasn't quite tomato season yet, but Some of those plants outdoors that needed to be protected, if you cover it, you're generally going to save them from being frostbitten. And generally, tomatoes, they do like fertile soil in a sunny location, so 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. So if you are growing these in a large container, again, you're going to need a good large container for tomatoes for that root system to spread out. You'll want to make sure it's in the sunniest spot, either on your balcony or in your yard. And of course, if it's in ground, pick that sunniest spot. Now, if you grew your tomatoes yourself under grow lights, you have to do the process of hardening off, which means you're acclimatizing your plants to the outdoors, which essentially you're bringing them out for short periods during the day. I do have a video about how to do that on the website. So at mindfulgardening.ca, you can find out how to harden off. And if you didn't start your tomatoes, it is a little too late. You're generally wanting to do that 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost, but garden centers will sell tomato plants. So you'll have those transplants, and they will have done that hardening off process for you, but you'll still want to make sure you plant them out after the frost date that we're looking forward to. And you want to keep in mind with tomatoes, both the nutrients that they're getting from the soil and the space that they have. They are heavy feeders, meaning they need a lot of nutrition to produce that lovely fruit that we love. So planting them too close to other tomatoes, for example, or other fruiting plants like peppers and eggplant. And again, this is for small spaces. I would limit to maybe 2 tomato plants next to each other. And again, you're still looking at about 2 to 3 feet apart. So you don't want them robbing too much from the soil. And also, you don't want them too close together because you do want that airflow. Tomatoes can be susceptible to disease if they don't have space between them. This is also why you want to maybe prune some of those bottom leaves so that they're not touching the soil, getting wet, getting sort of snuffed by the leaves around them. So that's something to think about. And also, you'll want supports likely for your tomatoes. There are bushing varieties, which we would call determinate. And then there's indeterminate, which tends to have all sorts of interesting varieties. And those are essentially a vine. So they'll grow and grow on you. So having a trellis or a cage is really important to support your tomatoes and prevent their stems from snapping. Now, for a new gardener, I always recommend cherry tomatoes because they tend to ripen quicker than your beefsteak or your sauce tomatoes. So usually in under 2 months, you'll be picking those off the vine and eating them. And they do take less nutrition from the soil than a bigger tomato, which kind of makes sense if you think about the size of what you're producing. You're always going to get more productivity on a cherry tomato by taking less nutrients from the soil. So that's my tip for tomato planting if this is your first year growing them. So what should you plant your tomatoes with then? Basil is a wonderful companion. They are said to actually improve the flavor of each. And of course, it's handy to have your tomatoes and your basil. They're often prepared together in salads or sauces. And also by having your basil plant, and again, you can plant it fairly closely underneath the plant. It'll actually sort of shade the soil underneath. It'll keep the root system cooler and moister because the sun isn't drying it out. And it can also suppress weeds. So it's really a win-win. Got your herb close by and it's protecting the soil. Now, I enjoy growing flowers as well with my veggies. And nasturtium, which you may know on the right here, is a beautiful edible flower. So the leaves and the flowers are edible. They have sort of a spicy flavor to them. They're also a good one to grow underneath. They have this sort of airy carpet look to them. They will sort of wrap around underneath plants without smothering them. So it's very light and airy and would have the same benefit to the soil underneath your tomato plants as basil does. And also, because it's flowering, it will attract pollinators, increasing your harvest. Beans. I really recommend beans for new gardeners or really any gardener. They're so nutritious. They're easy to grow. and you get high yield generally from them. And again, the nutrition value of beans is awesome to get that protein. And so they should be planted in warm soil. Again, they don't like the cold weather or frost that might hit its leaves. So you'll want to, again, plant those about a week after the last frost date of May 20th, and you should be fine. And keep in mind, in terms of space, that beans can be grown fairly close together. So your bush beans, you can grow them, half a foot apart is fine usually. And for pole beans, which unlike the bush bean, you're going to want a trellis, so some sort of support because they will climb. And pole beans do take longer to mature. So you're looking usually at 60 plus days, so a couple months for pole beans and just under 2 months for bush varieties. And there's so many different varieties, so many different colors, purple beans and striped beans, and just, a wonderful assortment that you should add to your garden and to your diet. So what should you plant your beans with? I recommend, and it's sort of a thought of growing some stuff above ground and some stuff underground near each other. So they're sort of have different nutritional needs. So growing your carrots next to your beans, they're not competing for space above the soil line. You've got all that action for the carrots happening underground, and they're getting their different nutritional needs underground. And beans do provide nitrogen to the soil. So you're benefiting from that for your leafy stuff. So if you grow Swiss chard or lettuce next to your beans, they're going to benefit from that added nitrogen from the beans. That's kind of a cool benefit of beans. And even at the end of the season, if you leave your bean plant to just decompose over the winter, it will just give your soil a beautiful hit of nitrogen. So don't remove your bean plants at the end of the season. Or even if you chop it up and just kind of leave them there, they will decompose into your garden and provide nitrogen. And there are so many different root vegetables, so things happening under the soil. Of course, your carrot, beet, radish, etc. They're packed with nutrients, and they're pulling minerals from the soil. So they are really just an incredibly nutritious thing to add to your diet. And they can be grown again in the fall. So a lot of these do appreciate the cooler weather. So you can think about growing them again at the end of summer for a fall harvest. Now, the trick with growing these, and again, you want your fertile, well-draining soil, so not rocky soil that will impede their root system. And when you do plant them, you'll want to thin them out so that once they start to sprout, thin them out so that they have the room to grow and create a good root. So a nice sized beet, for example, you're going to want to thin out to generally 2 to 3 inches to really be able to get that nice big root. So again, growing what you're growing with those roots, again, thinking about stuff underground and stuff above ground. So any of the lettuces do really well next to root vegetables. And having parsley in your garden is a great thing. Again, it's an excellent herb that grows above ground, and they won't be competing for the same type of nutrients. So they'll get along happily together. So I highly recommend any of the leafy greens and leafy herbs above ground next to your root vegetables. So your leafy greens, and again, there's such an assortment. Your lettuce, Swiss chard, spinach, mustard greens, kale, they grow really quickly and really well in pots. They generally have a shallow root system, so they're not searching too much for space, so that you can grow lots of things in pots that are these leafy greens. Mustard greens grow really quickly. It includes like arugula as well as a very quick germination. And you can have sort of what they would call a salad bowl, where you've got leaf lettuce, for example. So not a head of lettuce, but loose leaf lettuce that you can just snip through the season out of your container, and it'll just keep growing for you. And again, you're direct sowing in spring, and you can do it again in midsummer for a fall harvest. And the neat thing about leafy greens is they don't take up a whole lot of space, and you can have them grow immature, like they don't have to get large. For example, kale, you can eat it sort of as baby kale. So it's another plant that you can tuck in any spots that you find in your garden. So if you have, a little bit of space between your tomato plant and another plant, just put some seeds down and have some leafy greens growing there. And again, it will shade the soil, keep the roots nice and protected and moist, and also suppress weeds. So really think about using up space without selecting plants that really rob the soil, like the fruiting plants. But these leafy greens are a really good option for filling up space. And again, you can grow it with herbs like dill and all of those root vegetables. So beet is a good companion to any of your leafy greens. So herbs and flowers should really have a really good place in your garden, whether that's dedicated in your vegetable garden bed or amongst your perennials. So if you have a perennial bed, for example, you've got coneflower and black-eyed Susan, sun-loving flowers, if they grow well there, then your basil and your dill, your coriander, your parsley will do well beside them. And also, if you let them flower, not only will they create seeds eventually, which is an important part of the process, but the pollinators will come. So herbs are a great addition to have amongst your vegetables and amongst your perennials. And of course, including flowers, especially edible ones. So I did mention nasturtium before. Calendula is another wonderful one. It's also known as pot marigold. It's also something you can make salves out of, dry it for tea. It's just a really all around awesome flower to have in your garden. So really combining those herbs and flowers into your garden beds, they grow well in pots. You could do a dedicated herb pot just outside of your window on your balcony. They are just an amazing thing to have growing in your garden, and it doesn't take a whole lot of nutrition or effort to maintain them. You may have noticed I haven't mentioned squash in my presentation. So a note about squash, they do require a lot of space. So with my focus on small spaces, I don't generally recommend growing squash in a small garden space. They do require a lot of space, and they are heavy feeders as well. So if you imagine the effort it takes to grow a pumpkin, for example, or several pumpkins on your vine, they are taking a lot of nutrition from that soil and a lot of space. So a lot of these plants, their vines will crawl and very quickly take over your garden. If you do have the space, however, keep that in mind that they'll need a place to crawl or a trellis to climb, like cucumbers, for example. And I generally don't recommend they grow in pots. Again, they are heavy feeders and they're large and would just benefit from in-ground growing more than being dedicated to a pot. So that's something to consider. But if you're really wanting those, then make the space for them. And of course, watering. You want to keep your plants well watered, especially your new transplants. Once they're in the ground, you want to make sure that they do keep moist. You can mulch around them naturally as well. You can use leaves or straw to keep the moisture in. And especially in the heat of summer, usually June through August, you're going to want to keep your plants well watered. You can use a watering can or a garden hose or a soaker hose. Now, if you are using a hose or a watering can, try to keep the water as close to the bottom of the plant as possible. Getting the leaves wet can promote disease, especially with some of the plants like tomato, for example. If their upper leaves are too wet, it can lead to issues. So try to get close to the bottom. I love using soaker hose. So the image on the right, you can buy them at Canadian Tire or Home Depot, Home Hardware, and then hook it up to a timer. So I have it hooked up to my hose and it goes on certain times of the day. I don't have to worry about it. And it's so nice and close to the ground that it's not splashing my plants. It's slowly dripping, providing them with the water that they need. And of course, if you have plants in pots, they'll need even more attention with water because they, unlike in-ground plants, which will use their roots to search water and moisture underground, once your potted plants reach the bottom of the pot, there's nowhere to go, and they can suffer without water. So you'll want to make sure that your potted plants receive adequate water. Well, there we go. So in terms of resources, if you go to the Mindful Gardening website, I have a YouTube channel that has all sorts of videos from my home garden here in Innisfil. So how to harden off your plants, how to start your tomato plants, right through from pruning them to seed saving them. Also, I'll show you how to grow and harvest and store garlic, for example. And there's also, similar to my slides for each of those vegetables, I have seed planting guidelines on the website. So how deep do you plant the seed? How far apart should they be? Days to harvest. And I've tried to include most of our popular vegetables and herbs that we all enjoy. And I also recommend that you register for this whole series. So again, we're going right through till September, the Get Out and Grow program with the Rizzardo Health and Wellness Centre. We have an upcoming Q&A on June 16th, and that's where you can come and it'll be very informal. Just ask questions, what's happening in your garden. I can let you know what's happening in my garden. Might have similar challenges or similar things happening in our gardens that we can talk about. So again, you can find that information on the website as well. That will link you to the town website to register. Well, there we go. So now I be happy to take up any questions that you might have.
I have one. You didn't mention potatoes.
Well, potatoes are a wonderful thing to grow, but they do take up space. Have you grown potatoes before?
I've not. Well, I have not intentionally. Put it that
accidental way. Potatoes. I will tell you, last year I experimented. It's very interesting. I grew potatoes from their potato berries. So when potatoes flower, they create a berry eventually. So I got very interested in that process. I started them indoors like you would a tomato plant, for example. And I had about, I think, 18 plants in the end. And it took about 3/4 of my garden. As wonderful as that was, and I got all these fun, they were purple potatoes, which was fun. They took up a lot of space. So when I'm talking about, kind of planting in small spaces, potatoes are a tricky one. I've also tried growing them in large sort of bags. I actually bought yard bags, those sort of ones that pop up at the dollar store, and poked holes in them for drainage, and grew them in there, which worked well. It was hard to keep them well watered, but that's another option. But certainly you can, if you do have the space. I recommend seed potatoes that are meant for growing. You can also, in these days of the pandemic, you can try, growing your sprouted potatoes from the grocery store. It's just typically not recommended you do that. A lot of potatoes aren't sort of that you buy at the grocery store aren't really made for growing at home, but why not give it a try? Yeah, but they do take up space. Well, and you need a lot of soil because you need to hill them as well. Because as you hill the plant, the parts of the stem that are covered will produce more potatoes. So you'll want a lot of soil around the plant as well.
Okay. May I ask something else?
Sure.
Okay. I wouldn't be planting them for myself. I volunteered for a community garden, and I have sprouted potatoes in the basement that came from a garden, okay, not from the grocery store. So I'm wondering, how far apart would I plant them? It's not for a small garden. How far apart would I plant them, and what would I plant around them?
Okay. Yeah. So what you want to do is, when you select your potatoes, you make sure there's at least a couple of little sprouting eyes on them when you're growing them. And it's sort of the same spacing as a tomato plant. So I give it at least 2 to 3 feet between plants.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a community garden plot that you have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I mean, you could dedicate, half of the bed to that, and sort of grow them in trenches so that you can, like I mentioned, hill them. I do have videos on that on the YouTube channel. So if you go to mindfulgardening.ca, you'll find my journey of growing. I grew them by potato berries, but it's pretty much the same process of tending to the plant and harvesting them. So you'll find more information. You can actually see what my garden looked like with 3/4 of them taken. One tip I can give you is that generally you shouldn't plant other nightshade plants next to potatoes. They can sort of introduce similar disease, for example. So tomatoes, peppers, you don't want to grow next to your potatoes, because you could introduce also the same pests that would go on to your potatoes, could attack your tomatoes. But other than that, you can plant beans next to your potatoes, lettuce. It's just really the other nightshade plants you want to avoid.
Thank you. Okay.
Welcome. Good luck.
I'll need it.
Hey, it's fun. I always think it's an adventure. Like, I didn't know what would happen growing them from seed, and it was really a really neat thing to try.
I've tried to garden for a couple years now, and I've done more like rotating bed plots.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering, like, do you have thoughts on like that versus the companion growing, like combination of it? What kind of ideas?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of theories about companion planting, in terms of, like I'd mentioned, the basil and tomatoes improve flavor. It's said that if you grow your carrots next to your tomatoes, the carrots will be stunted but sweeter. I'm not sure how scientific some of that is. There is sort of discussion about more science-based companion planting. One thing I do try to avoid is onions and legumes. They tend not to grow well next to each other. That's kind of the only one I really hold fast and avoid, just because, you don't want to sacrifice plants in that way. But I suppose maybe someday I could experiment and see if that's true. But that's sort of a big one. A good resource that I like to follow is West Coast Seeds. So if you look them up, they're a seed company out west. They have a really good companion planting sort of guidelines. What grows well together, what should you avoid growing next to each other. And like with my where my potatoes were grown this year, I'm not going to plant my tomato plants or pepper plants there because, there may be pathogens in the soil that could hurt my tomatoes. So this year I'll grow beans, which can grow well with potatoes, and leafy greens and stuff like that. Maybe next year I can reintroduce a nightshade plant to that area. So it is good to sort of switch up where you're growing things, or if a lot of nutrition was taken out of a certain area, like when I grow my garlic, it's good to move that around so you're not constantly growing it in the same spot. And I have seen a difference because there were a couple of years where I planted my garlic in the same spot and they were stunted the next year, even though I fed the soil and, gave it extra nutrition, they were stunted. So it is a good idea to move your crops around.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
Welcome. I see a comment here, high winds on Big Bay Point area. Will my plants adjust? I guess it depends on which plants you are talking about right now. Because we are still sort of in early spring. Let's see, is Jennifer still on the call? She may not be on the call. Generally, again, in terms of wind and rain and all the stuff that happens when your plants are introduced to the outside world, it's the process of hardening off your plants is really important. So, if you've started your tomato plants indoors, getting them used to the outdoors is a slow process. So you don't want them sitting out in the blazing sun or in the wind or a rainstorm coming. You're generally starting by bringing them close to the house at first in the shade, giving them a little bit of sun during the day, and then eventually they're in the windier parts, because in the real world, that's where they're going to live. So getting that stem stronger with the wind. But again, if your plants aren't in ground yet, and you're concerned about that, just be cognizant of where they are on your back deck or on your balcony as you're prepping them for the outside world. But generally, right now, if you're growing peas or spinach, some of those cool weather things, they're most likely directly sown, and they will handle the weather that comes at them in the spring. So you don't have to worry about them as much as you would worry about transplants. Yeah. Are there any other questions, Sarah, that came in the chat box?
I haven't had any questions come through to me. Yeah, if anybody has any questions now for the end, you can either put them in the chat box or just unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, I don't mind people unmuting. It's kind of nice to hear people's voices. Lorraine?
Bridget, how do you test your soil, or what is the best way so that you know what nutrients your soil needs?
Now, I know there are soil kits out there where you could test to see, where your deficiencies are. Years ago, I bought one and I, tried it out, and it was a little bit confusing. It seemed to be really neutral soil, and it was a little bit discouraging. So what I've basically done over the years is just create really healthy soil with those amendments that I talked about. Like every fall, I will add the manure to my garden plot. I'll add the chopped up leaves, and you can literally see the life teeming in them. As soon as you disturb the soil, the worms are coming up, and all of that wonderful stuff. So I wouldn't worry too much about sort of the science of, where your soil levels are at. It's just creating that really healthy few layers of soil over the years, and you'll notice the difference. Something that I usually do first is if it's a completely new garden, I'll add a triple mix, so a commercial triple mix, get that delivered. But I always find it doesn't have enough. It has, a little bit of compost, a little bit of, those nutrients, but I always supplement again with the manure. I tried out the sea compost last year, which was really great, something I'd recommend. And again, I know some plants do well with like the bone meal for the tomatoes. Just from experience, I know that works well. So again, you're sort of seeing how your plants fare, like how well are they doing. If you're noticing your leaves are turning yellow through the season, they're probably deficient in nitrogen. When I mentioned the comfrey tea, I had a few potted bean plants, and their leaves were starting to yellow. And I gave, as they started flowering and they were, beyond a seedling, I gave them a hit of the comfrey, and their leaves literally changed color within a week. Lots of beans were growing. So I think it's sort of keeping an eye on your soil, and just really, it kind of becomes like a palette that you work with every season that just gets sort of healthier and healthier as you grow in it.
I noticed when I put bananas under my apple tree, I had the blossoms.
Okay.
Afterwards.
Interesting. Well, I would imagine it's probably the potassium.
Yeah.
In the banana peel. Yeah, because you want that potassium for fruiting, or for a good root system. But it would probably also help with fruiting. Yeah, there's a lot of tips and tricks. You can Google these things, and there's all sorts of resources out there and tips and tricks that people use. But yeah, it's the more organic matter you can put in your soil, like really avoiding a lot of those chemical sort of, quick fixes, I think is better to create naturally over time. because under your soil, there's so many microbes doing their magic. And also there's the tilling versus no tilling kind of idea. I like to break up the soil with my fork just to kind of bring air into the soil, but I don't, dig up too much. I just sort of plant things in this sort of healthy bed of soil that I've created over the years. Someone's asking if they've ever added extra worms to the soil. No. I mean, there's different theories on worms too, which made me sad. Worms are destroying forests. And, to me, a sign of worms in your soil is a good indication that, they're aerating your soil by creating tunnels. They are pooping in your soil, which is, as they call, black gold. If you vermicompost, where you allow worms to eat scraps and such, and then use that black castings that they provide into your soil, is just like magic. So it happens naturally, but I wouldn't introduce worms into my garden. But you will find, if you create healthy soil, like I mentioned, if you introduce those shredded leaves, which they love to eat, I can almost guarantee, maybe not the first season, but in that second season, if you take a fork in there and pull the soil aside, you'll see worms and a lot of other insects too. So asking about worms, yeah, there is a local lady, Kathy Nesbitt in Bradford. I know she sells the containers for the vermicomposting and the worms as well. She's called Kathy's Composters, I believe, and she's got a pretty comprehensive website. She was at one of our CD Saturday events a couple years back, which you may recall. So she's a good resource for worms. Asking about coffee grounds. Now, coffee grounds can add a lot of acidity to your soil. I generally avoid that. I feel like it changes the composition a little too much for me. But you can add your coffee grounds to your compost pile and let it work through. I just find it a little bit too harsh to put directly in the garden. And it's something I've never really incorporated. Yeah, if there's any other questions or something new you want to try this year, especially if you come back through the series to the upcoming Q&A, I'd love to see, how your potatoes did, or, what challenges you've had or successes. I like successes too. It doesn't always have to be problems that you're trying to sort out. Yeah. Are there any other questions from the crowd? I should also mention we're doing a project called Plant Grow Saber, which we just launched today. If you go to the Innisfil Seed Library website, so innisfilseedlibrary.ca, you can get a bundle of seeds. So we have peas, carrots, beets, okra, which is an interesting plant, and spinach. So you get 5 seed varieties. And the idea is you grow them at home, and we will be letting you know ways you can share that with your community. So saving some of that harvest for the community. So those are seeds you can plant right away. Our first pickup day is tomorrow. And again, you'll find the request form on the Innisfil Seed Library website, and reserve yourself some while supplies last. Just thought I'd mention that, especially if you want to try seeds out that you hadn't tried before. It's a sort of no pressure way to give it a try. There's just another question here about butternut squash, vertical gardening. Again, they are heavy, and some plants like to trail. I find like acorn squash, pumpkin, butternut, they tend to want to grow horizontally. You can try to train it up a trellis, but just have good support so you're not breaking the stems. Because once that fruit develops, they are quite heavy. So you'll want to figure out a way to support the fruit once it's vertical. Cucumbers, are a lot lighter and do well growing up a trellis. But some of those heavier winter squashes, like pumpkin, butternut, they do prefer to sprawl. So that's something to think about. Yes, looks like we've got another 5 minutes or so.
All right, that is great, Bridget. I know I learned a ton from this presentation, so I'm glad I got to sit in on it, and I hope everybody else learned a lot too. I can send out the links to everyone on the email list to the upcoming additional Get Out and Grow events, just so that you can have them. You don't have to go digging around for them. And yeah, any final questions?
We also mentioned the recording will be available as well, so people can come back to this recording.
Yes, that is great. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. And again, if you have questions at any time, please feel free to get in touch. I'm always happy to answer questions or just see your successes.